All righty. Welcome everybody to our third speaker of the 2022 annual SPUR conference. Thank you for joining us. Let's see here. Basically, just a recap of some of the procedures. We've got a talk that's between 10 and 15 minutes, and then we have follow-up questions for the remainder of the time. You can ask questions via the chat. You can ask questions via the raised hand function. If there's a pause, you can just go ahead and make yourself known and heard. I will help facilitate the Q&A portion. And we're going to record these videos, but the use of those recordings is sort of up to you. So they can be personal recordings that you can have, or you can have them hosted on the SPSP YouTube page. It's up to you. All right, so those are the ground rules. We are recording. I want to open up the presentation for Ashmita Mazumder, who is going to be talking about acculturative stress and connectedness. Ashmita, go ahead.
Thank you, Dr. Krause. And hello, everyone. My name is Ashmita, and I'm a recent graduate from the University of Toronto. And today I'll be presenting my SPUR project titled Associations Between Acculturative Stress, Social Connectedness, and Risk-Taking. I completed this project with Dr. Michelle Van Dellen and her Motivation and Behavior Lab at the University of Georgia. So acculturative stress refers to any emotional, social, mental stressor that is associated with the process of migration or adaptation to a new culture. The population that most often experiences such stressors are immigrants, and that's why they were the focus of our research project. While there are many forms of acculturative stressors, a few important examples are language barriers, economic hardships, experience of discrimination or prejudice. An important note to make here is that the larger the difference between the cultures that one needs to adapt to, the greater the experience of acculturative stress. So we can assume that the experience of acculturative stress is not universal to every immigrant population. So we further limited our observations on Asian immigrants only. Acculturative stress can lead to many maladaptive coping mechanisms. And indeed, past research has found that greater acculturative stress is associated with increased alcohol use, substance use, and gambling. Given these associations, it is important to manage acculturative stress post-migration. While there are many social factors that contribute to acculturative stress, such as discrimination, there are also many emotional factors involved. For example, immigrants might experience distress over cultural bereavement, as they may feel distanced from their familiar cultural values, languages, family, and friends. This can lead to feelings of isolation due to lack of social support. They may also face an imbalance between cultural and societal expectations, which can lead to a loss of identity and a loss of belonging. Immigrants often also face familial tension, as different generations of immigrants have different degrees of acceptance and adaptation to the mainstream cultural values, leading to, again, a lack of social support. So the common emerging themes here are loss of identity, loss of belonging, feelings of isolation, and lack of social support. Given this, social connectedness could act as a protective factor against acculturative stress. Social connectedness refers to the feelings of being close and connected to others and has been associated with better mental health outcomes. Social connectedness is also associated with lower risk-taking tendencies. So in our study, we hypothesized that greater acculturative stress would be associated with greater perceived discrimination, lower social connectedness, and greater risk-taking. We also hypothesized that greater social connectedness would be associated with lower risk-taking. Participants in the study were given a variety of questionnaires and tasks to measure our variables of interest. For acculturative stress, we gave them the social, attitudinal, familial, and environmental stress scale. For perceived discrimination, we administered the brief community perceived discrimination scale. For social connectedness, we gave them the social connectedness to mainstream and ethnic community scale. And for risk-taking, we administered the balloon analog risk task, which is a behavioral task. In the balloon analog risk task, participants are presented with a balloon, which they can pump up using the buttons on their screen. And each pump results in 0.5 cents being added to their temporary reservoir. However, like every balloon, these balloons also have an explosion point, which is unknown to participants. And the objective of the task is to collect the money before the balloon pops. We used two major outcome measures out of this task. The first one was the average number of pumps across trials, but the balloons did not explode. And the second one was the total number of explosions. This task has great ecological validity, which is why it was chosen for the project. Our results are based on an undergraduate Asian student sample who identified as either first generation or second generation immigrants. We chose an undergraduate student sample for two main reasons. The first being that they were convenient to recruit given our limited time and resources. And the second is that undergraduate students also undergo acculturative stress as they need to adapt to a new academic culture as well. So to recap, we expected that greater acculturative stress would be associated with greater perceived discrimination, lower social connectedness, and greater risk-taking. And we also expected that greater social connectedness would be associated with lower risk-taking. I'd like to now draw your attention to the correlation matrix on the right. As expected, we did find a moderate positive correlation between perceived discrimination and acculturative stress. However, we did not find support for our second hypothesis, even though the relationship was in the direction that we expected. The test was not significant, so no results can be drawn from these results. We also did not find support for our third hypothesis since the test was not significant. And for our fourth and final hypothesis, again, the test was not significant, so we cannot draw any conclusions from these correlations. Our results imply that perceived discrimination is a significant predictor of acculturative stress. Even with our small sample size, we did find a moderate positive correlation. So interventions that are aimed at integrating immigrants in the host country should really focus on this factor. Our results also imply that managing post-migration stresses are a complex and multifaceted process, which needs more research. And since acculturative stress contributes to many mental health outcomes, such as PTSD symptom severity and depression, the effectiveness of clinical interventions depends on our understanding of this experience. Our study is not without its limitations. Our major limitation is our small sample size. We only had 56 participants, which gave us very low power. We also had a biased sample since we only recruited undergraduate students, so our results are not generalizable. And while we did measure social connectedness, we did not measure whether participants had access to or did rely on the social connections in their community, which is a limitation that should be addressed in a future study. So in the next couple of months, we are hoping to recruit a much larger and a more generalizable sample. And we are also introducing a new manipulation where participants will be paired with a risk-averse or risk-seeking partner who would be a computer player, and we would observe their behavior pre and post their observation of this computer player. We are also expanding our study to look at other domains of risk-taking, such as health and safety and even social risk. Thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions, but I'd like to give a huge shout out to my mentor, Dr. Michelle Van Dellen, and members of the Motivation and Behavior Lab, who made it a very successful project. And thank you for your unwavering support. I'd also like to thank SPSP for this great opportunity and Dr. Michael Krause for being an incredible source of support these past few months. And I think I speak for our cohort when I say that we are very thankful for this platform. And I'm happy to take questions now.
Wonderful work. Thank you for that presentation. I want to go ahead and open up to questions from the audience via the chat, via the raised hand function. If you want to just speak now, you may. Maybe I can get us started first. Can I do that? I want to get us started. All right. I was thinking about, you're talking about the small sample and trying to scale up. One of the things, and about social connectedness, one of the things is like subgroups within Asian Americans, or and the networks and structures that are in place to allow people to receive support, right? So if there are normative mechanisms, if there are social groups, affinity groups that are in place and a critical mass of people, that might look different than, say, Asian American subgroups that are less well represented in that context. So that's just one of the things I'm thinking about. So when you're doing the sampling and trying to scale up, how are you thinking about it? What are you thinking about doing?
I think our main goal when we recruited Asian samples was that most of the Asian populations have a very collectivistic nature. We depend on our social connections and we depend on our community during our times of need. And that is a factor that I think is common for all Asian subcommunities. And that was our thinking when we recruited an Asian sample. We were very, very clear since the beginning that we would probably not get, we didn't even expect 56 people to get for our project. So we were clear that we wanted to recruit as many as possible, but definitely there is a difference. I would expect a difference in the experience of acculturative stress itself among the different subpopulations.
Yeah, no, that's that part I think is really fascinating, and some of the structures that are at play there.
Yeah.
Very cool. Other questions from the audience? Oh, from the chat. From Michelle, good job, first of all. But also, I'm curious about what you think about different risk behaviors and whether acculturative stress will be similarly linked across all risk behaviors, or if some risk behaviors might be more strongly associated with risk.
Yeah, this is a great question, and we did get into this conversation before. The reason we used a risk-taking task like BART, which is a financial risk-taking task, was because we were interested in the behavioral aspect of risk-taking and not the self-reported aspect. However, I do think that financial risk-taking might be more subdued in these populations, especially in undergraduates who might not have the liberty to extend their risk-taking to financial domains. However, when it comes to social risk-taking or health and safety risk-taking, I think we might see a different result because they might have the liberty to engage in some of those risk-taking behaviors. So there can definitely, which is why we're expanding the study for these different domains, because there's definitely a difference in the different domains. We do expect that.
Ashmita, I think this is the first time you've talked about the ability to be risky.
Yeah.
So it's a funny thing, right? Because risk is risk, but then it's like some risks are more risky than others. And like you have the ability to be riskier in some domains than others. So yeah, we'll talk more about that, but good answer.
Yeah, I think we also talked about the long-term and short-term effects of risk. When it comes to social risk or health and safety risk, the perception of risk itself can appear to be long-term. For example, when we're smoking a cigarette or having one drink, we don't expect that to affect us immediately, but a monetary loss or a financial loss is quite immediate. And that could be what is driving this low risk-taking behavior in the population.
Other questions from the audience?
I have a question. Yeah, the current study that you showed us used a undergraduate student sample, and you said like next steps is to expand outside of that. I wonder, like, what do you anticipate would be the difference between an undergraduate sample and a more representative? Because yeah, I'm trying to think about like how, like, it might be easier in some ways to find like communities to like support you in college, but maybe outside of that it might be more challenging, so these effects would be exacerbated. So what are your predictions, or what do you think?
I mean, I think there's many factors that go into social connectedness. Like We, as students, we have our communities in the university to depend on, but adults also have jobs, and they also have that job security and connectedness in their jobs to support them. However, I do believe that adults do have, again, more liberty to engage in those risks because they probably have the means to engage in those risks more than undergraduates do. So I think that's where the difference would come in. Of course, social connectedness is more of an individual factor that can depend across populations. But the risk-taking factor itself, I think, at this point really does depend on the means that they have to engage in those risks.
I think we have time maybe for one more question. Well,